And of course, in order to use Active Directory, we have to install it. This is going to be a little different than installing many of the other roles and services that I talk about in this course. It's definitely a little bit more involved. If you recall, when I talked about setting up Active Directory, it requires careful planning before you implement Active Directory. A lot of planning up front will prevent a lot of issues down the road, so it's good to make sure you plan how Active Directory is going to work in your environment before you start installing Active Directory. Unless, of course, you're working somewhere where some structure has already been thrust upon you because you're inheriting Active Directory, which I think is more common for most of us. That we kind of walk into an environment where it's already been set up in a certain way. But for those of us that are lucky, and walk into an environment where we're installing everything for the first time, it's good to get this right from the very beginning. And of course, as I said, in most cases, if you're doing this from scratch, it's probably for a relatively small organization that's just starting up, because most established organizations that are large already have all this, right? They've already been running Active Directory for quite some time, and you're kind of stuck with what they have. Then a lot of it is probably the way it is because of legacy reasons, which I don't really talk about some of the legacy things in older versions of Windows that might be why things are the way that they are, but I think it's good to at least have that understanding. So Active Directory is commonly referred to as Active Directory Domain Services, or ADDS. So to install ADDS, you're going to use the Server Manager, not unlike anything else that we've installed. One thing is DNS is required for Active Directory Domain Services. So you're going to have to make sure. So if DNS is not already present on the network, you have to install a DNS server role. So you have to have DNS installed, and it doesn't mean that DNS is running in some other platform. It has to be running in a domain controller somewhere. So you don't have to install DNS as long as something on the network is already providing that role service, DNS. And again, it has to be a Windows DNS server. You can't use third-party DNS with Active Directory. So if you recall from DNS, actually we haven't talked about it yet in this course, but when we do talk about DNS, you'll learn about different types of records, and there's some extensions in DNS for Windows that add some additional types. Some of that's stuffed into the text records, but there's additional information that's needed by Active Directory in DNS that you won't really be able to do easily with other DNS servers. I'm sure it's possible, but generally it's better to have DNS running on a Windows server with Active Directory somewhere on the network. Again, it doesn't have to be on that server. If it's the first Active Directory server that you're installing and you don't have DNS, it's going to let you know that you have to install that. So you might want to do that ahead of time. After the role is installed, you have to configure Active Directory. You're going to click the notification flag in Server Manager and click Promote this server to a domain controller. And that's going to be the most important part, promoting it to a domain controller. So you're going to install the role, and then you're going to promote it to a domain controller. So in the deployment configuration window, you're going to have basically a couple options. So you can add a domain controller to an existing domain, or you can add a new domain to an existing forest. So you can add a domain controller to an existing domain, or add a new domain to an existing forest, or add a new forest. So if this is the first domain controller that you're installing, then you're going to be adding a new forest, because essentially you can't have a tree without having a forest, and you can't have a domain without having a tree. So if it's the first one, then all of that entire hierarchical structure is being set up for the first time. So it's it's kind of confusing. Some people get confused by that. But a new forest is essentially the first domain controller. It's your first domain. Even though maybe you're only thinking about it as a single domain, and it's kind of redundant to say a tree and a forest because you only have one domain, it's essentially a domain within a tree within a forest, even though there's only one. So again, we could be adding a domain controller to an existing domain. We could be creating a new domain in a forest that already exists, or we can be adding a completely new domain controller the first time on our network. There's no other domain controllers running on our network. In general, if you have domain controllers on your network, you do not want to install a new forest. It really won't make sense to do that, and it can cause some issues down the road. So that would be a new domain to an existing forest in that case. So next, you're prompted for the fully qualified domain name, or the FQDN, for the new forest root. So the FQDN is a domain name that includes all of the parts of a domain, or all the parts of a name. So it's the FQDN. So for example, if I have a domain called I don't know, the bank, and it's thebank.com, but this is the St. Louis office, maybe my FQDN would be stlouis.thebank.com, right? So that's kind of what they're talking about with an FQDN. So an FQDN is the fully qualified domain name. You'll need to know that before you go through the steps of promoting your domain or promoting your new server to a domain controller. So in the domain controller options, you will choose the Forest and domain functional levels, select the domain controller capabilities, which would be DNS, a global catalog, a read-only domain controller, and then you'll enter a password for directory services restore mode. So it's a boot mode used to perform restore operations on Active Directory if it becomes corrupted or parts of it are deleted accidentally. So again, that's one of the risks with the distributed file or a distributed database is the accidental deletion or accidental corruption of data. Because if something poisons that hierarchical database structure and it's distributed, there's this trust relationship between all these different nodes, and if that gets broken, then it can cause issues down the road. So there's some ways to fix that. So this is what that dialog looks like. I'll talk more about a global catalog and RODCs in just a little bit. So in the DNS options window, you have to create the DNS delegation, which allows Windows to create the necessary records in the DNS server for the new domain. So if you're creating a new domain, it has to tell the domain controller about this new domain, the DNS server about this new domain so that it has the understanding of this domain because it's going to add some records for that. In the path window, you will specify the location of the Active Directory database, log files, and sysvol folder. And there are some defaults in there, but you could change those if you need to. Then you're going to review all of your selections, and Windows then does a prerequisite check before starting the Active Directory installation to make sure that everything looks okay. So it'll warn you if anything looks like it's not going to work, basically. All right, so Microsoft recommends at least 2 domain controllers in every domain, and that's mostly for redundancy and load balancing, so fault tolerance and load balancing. So in other words, if a domain controller, if you only have one domain controller and it goes down, no one's going to be able to log into the network. I mean, you'll be able to log in for a little while on workstations that you've logged into before, but if you're trying to log into a new workstation, you won't be able to log in, and that's, of course, not good. Nobody wants to come into work at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning only to find out that their only domain controller has crashed and no one can log in. So, that's obviously not a good situation. So you definitely want to have more than one domain controller. You can install additional domain controllers in an existing domain. It's not unlike installing the first domain controller, except that you select the option to add a domain controller to an existing domain or add a new forest. So when a new domain controller is added, you need to know the answers to the following questions. Are you going to need to install DNS? Should the DC be a global catalog server, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes? Should it be a read-only domain controller? In which site should the domain controller be located? So there's 2 variations to adding a domain to an existing forest. You could be adding a child domain if you're adding a domain that shares at least the top level and second level domain name structure as an existing domain. Or you can add a new tree if you're adding a new domain with a separate naming structure from an existing domain. So in other words, if you already have a domain, you can add a child domain. So if my domain is thebank.com, I could add a child domain called stlouis.thebank.com, and it would be a child to thebank.com. But let's say thebank.com has some other business unit called creditfirst.com, right? Maybe some other business unit. Then that would be a new tree called Credit First, and it would be a new tree in that forest, in that domain forest. So those are the 2 options. So this is the dialog box where you would configure those options. All right, so if you're installing Active Directory on Server Core, if you recall, Server Core does not have a UI. You could use the server manager from another server, but you could also just use the PowerShell. So the command to promote a domain controller from PowerShell is dcpromo.exe, along with the answer file. The answer file is required if you're just going to run dcpromo.exe. In Server Core, it's not going to be able to open up the dialog box to walk through all those options that we just talked about. So you have to provide an answer file that allows it to silently go through that process to promote the domain controller. In many cases, if you're using Server Core, it's probably it's not the first domain controller on the network, and typically, so you probably already have all of those options, and you can create that answer file. All right, so to install Active Directory domain services role, you can use the command-led add Windows feature and then AD domain services. So that's to install the role. So first you'll have to install the role with the PowerShell commandlet. And then you can include management tools parameter. And then the next command starts the promotion process. The command you use to depend on the type of installation you want. So to start the process, you can install add AD DS forest with your new domain name. If you're adding a whole new forest, you could be adding a new domain. So this is if you want to add a domain controller to an existing domain. And this is the command that you would run if you want to add a new domain to an existing forest. So you have to specify the new domain name here. So installing a new domain controller, sorry, I get that backwards there, that CD should be DC. So when you're installing a new domain controller in an existing domain, it has to be updated with all existing data in the AD database. So as I said before, Active Directory is the distributed database, but so they're constantly replicating between all of the nodes. That way, you could query any node in the distributed database and you'll get your answer. By the way, DNS is a distributed database as well. If you're familiar with how DNS works, it's a distributed database, and you might be familiar with all the challenges that go along with that. Well, one of the problems with DNS is if you make an update, sometimes it takes a while for that replication to happen across the entire internet. And domain name system is a relatively simple protocol overall. I mean, how it works is not complicated. It does a relatively simple thing, but just in a complicated way. Active Directory is kind of the same in that regard, where it's a relatively simple concept, just implemented in a complex way. That if you set up a new domain controller, it has to replicate all of the other domain controllers before it can become a useful node as a domain controller. It has to replicate from all of the other nodes on the network, and it has to get all those updates before it can consider itself, an actual, node that you can use. So for that to happen, it might take some time. So one way you can get around that, the time it takes for that replication to happen, is you can prepare for this ahead of time by installing from media, the IFM option. So basically what you'll do, and by the way, it reduces the replication traffic needed to do the update when you first install the domain controller. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to find the domain controller from which you're going to create the IFM data file. Then on that domain controller, you're going to run the ntdsutil command, which is going to look a little bit like this. And using that command, it will create the IFM data file that you're going to use when you install your new domain controller. So when you're installing the new domain controller, if you're using Server Manager, you'll click Install from Media checkbox. And when you do that, it's going to ask you for the path to this file. And then it'll automatically import all of those settings. And then it will do yet another replication in case there's ever any changes since you made that IFM file, which of course is going to happen on a really large, busy network. When you create that, from the time you create that file to the time that you actually try to implement it, there's likely going to be changes. But not to worry, Active Directory will actually handle all of that for you. But that's basically how you're going to do this from the IFM file. All right, so in the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about some of the functions in Active Directory, so some of the things that you can do with Active Directory. Then we'll talk about domains, and then finally group policy.